What wedges should you carry in your bag? Do you know what an A-wedge is?
Before we get into it, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. We upload golf content weekly. Hey guys, Tyson and Brady with Golf Ascending. Today we're going to talk about wedges. What are their names and which ones you should carry in your bag?
Does your current iron set end at pitching wedge? Do you have a sand wedge? Did you know that there are clubs that fit between the two? All right, so let's say you're 90 to 130 yards away from the green. Your pitching wedge might be too long, your sand wedge might not get you there. And you may have to improvise and do a 3/4 to a half swing and hope you can get the right distance. So this could be a problem if you don't have clubs to fill in those gaps.
So generally speaking, iron sets contain a 4-iron down to pitching wedge, or PW. And the pitching wedge is about 45 degrees. This may vary a degree or two. Something important that you should look into is the brand of your clubs and what loft they are. This is important because the pitching wedge is a good starting point when trying to figure out which wedges you need to add to your bag.
Another common wedge to have in your bag is the sand wedge. The sand wedge is typically 56 degrees in loft. And so if the pitching wedge is typically 45 degrees and the sand wedge is 56, then you got about 11-degree loft difference there. And a good rule of thumb is that 4 degrees of loft equates to about 10 to 15 yards in distance. So if you have an 11-degree gap, that could potentially be 30 to 45 yards in difference between those two clubs. So you're going to want a club to kind of gap that distance.
So the club that Brady was referring to that fits between the pitching wedge and the sand wedge is actually known as the gap wedge. It also is known as an A-wedge, and we'll get into what the A-wedge actually is later. But as you can see, the gap wedge is a 50 degree, at least mine is, and this falls right in between the pitching wedge, which is about 45, which we discussed, and the sand wedge, which is 56. And so I get my distances covered there. As you guys can see, so we've got the gap wedge that is in the middle of the pitching wedge and sand wedge. And then I also have this other club here. This is a lob wedge. So this club helps me extend my distances. So in shots where I'm, really close to the green, I want to, pop it up really high and make it sit on the green. This is what, club I would use there. If it's, a shot that's 50 yards away, I could potentially take a full lob wedge and land it and stick it on the green. So it's really helpful, if I want to take a full swing versus a half swing or a 3/4, I've got different options in my bag. Aside from using these clubs for distances alone, these clubs are also great around the green. Your pitching wedge and gap wedge are really good for bump and runs to roll the ball up to the green. Your sand wedge and lob wedge are good for popping the ball up and having it sit right before the cup. Some other use cases for them are out of the sand, which you generally use the sand wedge or a 54 degree, 56 degree. And then another use case is a lob wedge where you want to flop it up really high and just have it sit right on the dime.
And for those of you who are probably new to golf, a lob wedge isn't totally necessary. It can actually be a pretty difficult club to hit, but it is pretty great if you do want to add that to your set. So just a second ago, Tyson referred to the gap wedge as the A-wedge also. I have an A-wedge right here. So before I go on, comment below what you think the A stands for in A-wedge. All right, did you comment? Enough time? All right. So the A-wedge, the reason we brought that up and wanted you to comment is a lot of people call it different things. But the A stands for, and is most commonly known as the approach wedge or the attack wedge. So if anyone ever asks, it's either approach or attack, and it's basically the same thing as a gap wedge.
All right, so just as Brady just mentioned, the attack wedge and the gap wedge are virtually the same thing. So that brings me to a story that came up a little bit ago. my grandpa came over for dinner and he was bragging about his new clubs that he got. And these were the Callaway Rogue X irons. And he was telling me how cool they were, and telling me that, they were stronger lofted, and I was really intrigued. Because, lately with technology, you're able to hit your clubs a lot further. So, he was telling me I have, 4-iron down to pitching wedge, and then I've got an A-wedge and a G-wedge and an S-wedge. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You have an A-wedge and a G-wedge? I was really confused because I thought, hey, aren't these the same things? And so I actually did a Google search, looked for the specs of these Callaway Rogue X irons, and lo and behold, there was an attack wedge or approach wedge and a gap wedge. And I was like, what the heck is going on? And so as I looked further into it, I noticed that the pitching wedge was lofted at 41 degrees. This is actually typically like a 9-iron degree loft. And so it makes sense why they had 2 gap wedges in between there, because they had to fill 2 clubs difference until they got to the sand wedge. And so I ended up, showing my grandpa this, and it actually turned out he was hitting the gap wedge and the approach wedge out of order. And so I ended up helping him in the long run. So quick story, the thing I want you guys to take from this is, with your irons and your wedges, make sure that you look online at the specs. You never know what degree of loft they are. And so, it can help you get the lofts that you need in wedges, as well as help you out at the top end of your bag as well, which we'll have a video about gapping at the top end of your bag as well.
All right, to summarize, what wedges should you have in your bag? First, you need to know the specs of your iron set. Know what the lofts are, so then you can establish which wedges to add to your bag. So for reference, typically a pitching wedge is anywhere from 45 to 48 degrees. And then you got your gap wedge, which is generally 50 to 52 degrees. Your sand wedge, typically 54 to 56, and lob wedge, 58 to 60. And so once you know your iron set, you can establish your wedges, what fits your game best to gap those distances, and what to use around the green.
Yeah, and make sure that in your gapping, remember that 4 degrees of loft is about 10 to 15 yards. And so use that as your measuring tool.
Exactly. So when you know your iron set, you can do 4 degrees after that.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. If you did like the content, make sure you comment down below what wedges you use in your bag. And also click the notification bell for all future golf content.